Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading property experts as they share with you the insider's guide to property investing.
All right, folks, you're on the Property Couch, the insider's guide to property investing. I'm Bryce Holdaway and he's Ben Kingsley, and welcome for another week of the insider's guide. How are you, Ben?
Good, mate. You?
Very well, thank you.
That is good.
What a lot of our listeners might not know, Ben, is we actually, outside of the Property Couch, we run a business together.
We do.
Called Empower Wealth,
Yes.
here in Melbourne. But it's kind of, this time of the week's always good because despite the fact that we rattle around in the same building for most of the week, we don't actually get a chance to have a chinwag until we catch up on the Property Couch.
That's right. I'm deep in designing property investment portfolios and plans for clients, and you're out there buying the properties that we recommend.
Now, I spoke interestingly to an 80-year-old this week.
Really?
He was in Sydney.
Yeah.
Ex-property valuer, ex-real estate agent. He's got a principal place of residence that's doing very well in the Sydney conditions at the moment, about 1.9.
Nice.
He's got $1 million outside of the family home in cash, plus $450,000 in a term deposit. And he said to me, he goes, I want to invest my money. Where should I invest it? And he'd already had Brisbane in mind. And he goes, the reason I want to buy in Brisbane is because I don't have a 10-year outlook. I've only got a 3-year outlook.
Yeah, good point. So timing the market's important to him. But there are a lot of people. I mean, here's the interesting part about what I observe in that is that here's a valuer who's obviously got a lot of understanding of property, but potentially hasn't executed other than his principal home because he's probably had paralysis by analysis, or he's so close that he can't see the wood between the trees. You know, like that's the classic story, and there's so many of them. Or what about agents that you run into and in their journey they've bought 12 or 15 homes, and you say, how many got left now? And they go, oh no, I sold them. You know, I thought the market was peaking, and so I got out. I'm like, seriously? I mean, property it's not a transactional asset. You know, the ins and out costs are extraordinary. So I don't understand it. So it's amazing that, those sort of people can't do that. And now, obviously, with term deposits and really low, returns on investment in the sort of banking sector, we're seeing more of that. And we're seeing, from self-managed super fund side of things as well, people are coming to us. Other companies use our services and refer to us as well around people who've got 450, 500 in TDs, term deposits, and they're looking to sort of, move out of those, but they're not necessarily thinking a bit too much risk in the share market space. So they're thinking residential property because it's obviously well accepted that it goes all right.
But it's such a shame. He had so much knowledge. He understands cycles. I was talking to him about the Sydney peak of 01 and he was all over it. He knew his cycles. He knew it well. He'd done some stat because you can't be an 80-year-old with a $2 million principal place resident, $1 million in cash for. You can't do that unless you're savvy in some sense. And he didn't go into too much detail about how he
got to the journey,
got to that point. Yeah. But I found him fascinating. I quickly realised that he, in terms of his advice that he needed, he really just needed someone to help him execute because he had some really good background.
Yep.
But it's a shame that you can't get someone like that in schools and let them talk to your kids because he has loads of stories. He loves a chat. He obviously liked the interaction, and he was really realistic about what he could do.
But it goes back to that same sort of theory around looking after households and each household's unique and each household's different, and teaching them some fundamentals, which is what we want to do today, isn't it?
It is. Now, one of the things with our podcast, for our regular listeners, they know that this is kind of the, next week is the building on the week before. But if you've just stumbled across our podcast and you're sort of starting from some of the latter episodes of the podcast, Ben and I was chatting just before we started recording, just to encourage you to actually go back to the beginning, because for those people that have actually been listening each and every week, there's actually a foundation that's being built on. Whereas if you're coming in towards the latter end, some of the concepts that we're talking about might sort of seem a little bit, what's the word? Kind of
advanced, maybe.
Advanced or no context.
No context, advanced. Yep, I think that's a good way of analysing it. And then so the idea, listeners, is to just pop back to the start, because when you listen to a podcast, and Bryce and I listen to other people, there's great podcasts out there, so it's a great way of learning and educating yourself. So what normally happens is once you finish episode 65, then episode 64 starts if you're at the end of that. So what we're saying to people is, in our particular case, given we're episode 16, it's best to if you enjoy this episode, start from the start, because there's some fundamentals that we've already unpacked, and today's another session where we're going to unpack some really critical fundamentals as well.
Speaking of the start, very good point, Ben. The first one is we fix bad property investment advice was our initial one. It was a bold statement.
But it's true. We've got a lot of people who come to us who have got a portfolio that's underperforming, or they've bought a dud, their first one, and they still see other people making money out of property, and they come to us to try and see whether they can rectify that. So usually it's a case of poor structure in their lending side, but the fundamental one is the asset selection. It's a dud. They've bought a lemon. So we've got to re-engineer what we can do around that work, and in terms of finding them a better selection and a better way of finding good property.
So in terms of fixing bad property investment advice, the ideal scenario for us through these podcasts is to give people information that fixing potentially bad property investment advice. So hopefully they actually haven't pulled the trigger
before they start,
and so they can make better decisions. But there are some clients, we've got clients where we're just recently helping a couple who we're helping them buy their fifth property, and the first four in mining towns, and their equity situation is heavily negative. So that's a situation that required a little bit of life support.
And I'll add to that. So how long have you been in the business now for, Bryce, with us?
3 years.
3 years, wow. So there you go. So when Bryce came in, he obviously came in with a wealth of knowledge. And so Bryce and I sat down and we basically wanted to build a framework. Bryce is fantastic on these types of things, whereas my headspace is normally in the clouds in sort of analysing and fundamental analysis and statistical analysis and other things that I'm doing. So what I loved about this concept is when we're playing with other people's lives and we're playing with their money, building out a process. And obviously the business has been very successful, and we've built out a process, but refining that process that it's consistent but allows us to tailor solutions to each client was the foundation of that. And again, as advisors, as professional advisors, we carry risk in terms of looking after people's money, so we've got to get it right every time. And so this framework is what people pay thousands and thousands of dollars to us for, and you're getting it as an insight in this podcast right now.
Yeah, we're trying to give out as much information as we can for free so that people are actually making good decisions, because the property investment industry has been good to us, Ben.
It has.
So it's a chance for us to be good to the property investment industry, and that's for the listeners to judge. Ben, if you build a house, you put the footings down, then you put your framework up, then you push your walls, put the building, then you do everything in terms of your fit out internally. Yeah. You can't start with the fit out first. You got to do the footings first. And the point is, when you go to the hairdresser, they're going to wash your hair before they cut it. When you go to the solicitor, they're going to ask you some questions before they give you advice. There's all these professionals that have a process that they follow. Your accountant has a process. Professionals need a process to follow. But the challenge with property investment is that most people, in our experience, in our observation, they don't actually follow a process. They get caught in what I call the microscope of property investing, and they don't take the time to look through property investing through the telescope. So we thought we'd talk today about the 5 essential steps that any investor, whether they're a first-time investor, whether they're an experienced portfolio builder, whether it's the 80-year-old that I was talking to during the week, everyone has to follow these steps in order to get an optimal outcome.
They do, and I think, I'm just looking at it now in terms of, because obviously it's part of one of our brochures, and it's part of our process that we go through. And I think, down the track through these podcasts, we could spend a lot of time in each one of these. So we will do that. But for this podcast, because the first, 24 podcasts that we're trying to get out into the marketplace is building that baseline knowledge, that entry-level knowledge that you absolutely need. Because in reality, paying for good advice is a brilliant thing. And I know you were talking about the analogy of building a home. In reality, if I can go down to the hardware store, I can buy the bricks, I can buy the wood. I know that I've got to basically build some studs, some frames, and I've got to put some 45 angles together, and eventually I'll get a pitched roof and I'll put some bricks around the outside. But if I try and do that all myself, I'm going to make mistakes. I'm going to have to rework it. There's going to be time delays. And that's why most people go and seek professional advice, because the good ones, the smart ones, know they're going to eliminate the mistakes. And so let's get into it. The first one is clarify. So When we talk about our first 2 points here, what we're talking about is understanding the individual or the household's opportunity or potential. Now, my big story here is I was at a dinner party once, and people asked me about my business, and there was one particular person at the dinner party when I said, I honestly think I could change every household or every person's life that I come in contact with. And that was around money management and around property. And they said, oh, no, that's impossible. Not everyone can afford to do what you need to. And I said, I believed, so I didn't get into it at the dinner party. I didn't want to get the vibe down, but I absolutely felt that's wrong. Even if you're on welfare, I still think there can be some money management tips, and there's some things that we can actually do to help people. So from that point of view, everyone has that opportunity, everyone has that potential, and our role and what we're doing now here in this podcast is about coaching you and getting that potential out of you. So the first point is clarify. And what we mean by clarify is we're absolutely collecting information about your story, and your story not only from a financial perspective, but also from a personal perspective. We want to understand what money will do for you. We want to understand your goals, your dreams, your aspirations, the challenges, the concerns, the anxieties that you're feeling. You've heard me say before, your state of wallet plays with your state of mind. So once we collect all that information, and if we only have a baseline understanding of that information, it's useless. So we want to get down into the layers. What do you spend on your car? What do you spend on utility bills? What do you spend on phones? What do you spend on gym? Where does all your money go, and what's left at the end of the day, which is part of that, A, B, C, D that we've talked about previously in the podcast. So that's what we're trying to do when we get all that information, and then where do we take that information, Bryce?
Well, the interesting part about what you just said then is quite often I'll have someone come into me, and as a buyer's agent, the first port of call is, look, I want to buy an investment property. And I'll sort of try to say to them, can I, because I'm naturally trained to try and understand the client as best as I can. Yep. And quite often they're quite defensive. No, I don't want to tell you about my spending. I don't want to tell you about what I'm doing. And I can actually go and facilitate a transaction. That's easy. It's just transferring the title from one person's name to the next. That's the straightforward part.
And we see heaps of buyers agents who do just that, don't they? And financial planners, same thing. Yep. They're guilty of, all right, if that's your circumstances, this is what we've got left over. You want to do some managed fund transfers, bang, let's do them. And I just find that's dangerous, and I just feel as if
it's actually not fulfilling, because I've facilitated transactions in every state and territory in this country as a part of my role with being a property investment advisor for the last 16 years plus. Location in Australia. But if it's just a transaction facilitation, that's okay. We can do that. But Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. One of those habits, begin with the end in mind. Yeah. And so really at Clarify, we've got to begin with the end in mind. And in my experience, most people don't know what the end is. They've got a dream, but they don't have a goal. The dream is financial freedom. I want to be wealthy. I want to have loads of money. That's the dream. Yeah. But what's the goal? How much by when? And so for us, it's about finding out what their short-term goals are. Maybe it's just to get out of a bit of credit card debt. Yep. And then the long-term goal is I want to make $75,000 passive income without getting out of bed by the time I retire. And so for us, that's once we can understand that better, we can then do step 2, which is evaluate.
Yeah, so when we get into the evaluate size, this is where we get into the numbers, where we start crunching numbers around, assess and analyse. And how we do it in Empower Wealth is we measure cash flow movements every month for the next 40 years. Now, there are people who might do a back of envelope calculation on what they can afford today and what they think they can afford tomorrow. But the real science, the real art is understanding that cash flow. And I can tell you why from a property point of view is if you can precisely measure those cash flow movements, you can be more accurate in the recommendation around the value of the property you're buying and what performance you need from that property, as opposed to the novice or inexperienced rookie and investor. They'll just go, I just want the best return, and not understand the science around yielding properties versus cash flow growth properties. So for us, getting to that nitty gritty gives a lot of confidence to the user as well in terms of the client, around making sure that they say, well, I can afford this today. And, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because we were thinking about starting a family. So many people put off investing and wealth building until they're in their 40s and 50s and they've got to scramble. Whereas you could have actually still potentially achieved a property investment whilst also, buying your own home, whilst also having children. And it just means it's different. It mightn't be the normal asset that we go for or whatever it may be. But you're away, and then you come up for air. 6 or 8 year kids are now in primary school. You've got a bit more time. The cost of childcare and nannies and all of those things or whatever have dropped away, and now you're ready to go. So from that point of view, it just makes our job as professional advisors so much better. And for you, if you're thinking about being DIY, you've got to understand money sitting on offsets. What does it do for you? Global portfolio positions, global cash flow positions, tax impacts of every step that you're making. They can't work that out.
No.
I mean, I remember when we built the simulator software back in 2007, it took us 2 years to build because we wanted to get it right rather than just looking at each property in isolation.
And if you think about that simulator, you trying to get that information is tough because if you do your budget, most people do their budget on an Excel spreadsheet, which is fine, which is effectively month to month. Trying to project forward, there are some software in the marketplace, but when it comes to property investment, it's in isolation.
Correct.
Silos. So you buy one property, you want to buy the second, it treats it in second, or you might go to a financial planner or whatever, and they've got they've got their sort of proprietary software. But there's 3 areas that we need to cover. We have talked about this in previous podcasts, but you've got to cover the basics of food on the table, money in, money out, keep the lights on. Second thing is hopefully with your surplus left over, you've got something to put it towards. Most people put it towards lifestyle, let's be honest. But a select few put it towards assets or debt reduction. And then the third area you've got to master and monitor is the bucket list, the things that you want to achieve in life.
Correct. Big rocks in the jar, as I like to call them. If you've ever heard or read it in my articles in any of the publication magazines and so forth, it's property. Yes, we fundamentally do property investment every day, but I'll give you an example. Yesterday I had a great couple come in. They've been fortunate to get an inheritance and they're thinking about what their next step is. And then they're comfortable in their family home, but the reality is that it's a townhouse, and now they've got this inheritance. They're sort of thinking, well, do we invest it or do we buy the family home? And so it's again about peeling the onion layers back and then getting to the nitty gritty. And we really did establish that a family home is the best thing for them to do. So we are now going to analyse whether we can keep the existing property, turn it into an investment property, and buy that family home that has the backyard and so forth. Because there's no benefit in having a property that's just going to sit there and not be happy, or to have money in the bank and have no fulfillment. I mean, there's other cases and it was her uncle that built up this mega wealth, and he'd be at home sitting in front of a heater with no lights on. So sometimes, again, it's the psychology of mindset, and we'll talk about that another day in terms of investing. But yeah, that's the session that is step 2, which is the evaluate. Once we can evaluate that, that's when we can really start to show how a plan can get them in on that journey.
Agreed. So, folks, this is we're going to get to 20 minutes very, very quickly. So we're actually going to
have to break this up over a couple of weeks.
Yeah, we're going to do it over 2 parts. So we'll keep going, and we'll send this out to you as part 1 and part 2. So we're respectful that sometimes you can only digest 20 minutes at a time, but there's lots of really good information here. So we will sort of keep pushing on because I think it's really valuable to sort of tie together some of the concepts that we've done prior. But so that's the clarify, the evaluate. Third step is planning, Ben, and that's where we think that most people find it difficult to put a written plan in place to actually know what they're going to do. So in the absence of that, in my experience prior to us being involved in the simulator that we use every day, it was essentially, do you have equity? Yes. Therefore, you should buy an investment property. That's your strategy.
And if you don't, have you got a self-managed super fund? If anyone ever asks you, have you set up a self-managed super fund when you're talking to a property investment advisor or a real estate agent or a marketeer, run 100 miles.
Yeah.
I mean, isn't that them automatically trying to sell you something as opposed to advise you on something? If you've got super money, make sure you speak to someone who's qualified to give you advice on the pros and cons of setting up such a fund, because it's very dangerous.
Yes, no, it was interesting. There was an article this morning I was chatting to Ben just before we started, pushing a record here, that one of the leading industry figures in the mortgage broking space suggests that the challenge that the SMSF space has right now is the property spruikers, and we have had a chat about property spruikers. But his sort of left field suggestion was that SMSFs should be restricted to not being able to buy properties less than 2 years old. I don't know if that's the answer, but it's an interesting commentary because ultimately the property spruikers, and that essentially probably this conversation today is born out of the prevalence of the property spruikers because there are a lot of really good advisors in our industry. You're part of PIP, you see lots of them. We bump into lots of them throughout the country. So there are some really good guys around, guys and girls.
Yep.
But
all the good ones are members of PIPA. And if you're not a member of PIPA and you're listening to this broadcast and you are ethical and honest and trustworthy, go to www.pipa.asn.au and become a member, because we're going to continue to keep throwing this message out there to consumers of buyer beware. Now, if you play or...
That was interesting. You almost forgot the website then. I saw you...
I was sort of thinking of that off the top of my head. It came out. It came
out very well.
So the trouble space for property investment is usually in the new or off the plan stuff. Now, that again is not saying that we need to put everyone in the basket of being a spruiker who promote new and off the plan. That's not what we're about. There are some new stock and some off the plan stuff that could deliver good returns. It's about understanding the agenda of the person who's giving you the advice, and they may only have a few things to offer you, but understand, dig deeper, ask questions. It's not just about population growth, and it's not just about bling or tax. If that's their three weapons of trying to convince you that it's a good investment, dig deeper or move on.
Yeah, no, there are some good guys out there who do deal with the brand new stuff. It's just the point is that just have an awareness around how they get paid, what their agenda is, so that if you make a decision to buy through one of them, you've got your eyes wide open. Step 1, clarify. Step 2, evaluate. Step 3 is the plan.